My name's Dan Clegg. I'm from Chilliwack, as she said, which is, can you hear me in the back now? Yeah? Okay. I do have a loud voice. I'm from Chilliwack, which is about 100K up the Fraser River from here. I grew up on a farm. I spent my time in the forest. My dad was a man of the woods, as you could say. Like, he's a very natural kind of guy. My mom was part of a Mennonite Christian community. In Chilliwack, there are First Nations people and reserves everywhere, but I didn't know much about them other than through the arts I saw in town growing up. I went to a public secular school. As a kid, I lived on the borders between my dad's naturalism, my mom's Mennonite culture, and this First Nations culture at quite a distance, and then this sort of secular nationalism from my daily life in public school. I had a few really great teachers, but I didn't like school. My dad and my mom taught me the forests, lakes, rivers, how to live among them. School didn't teach me much that I found relevant. Even though I was very culturally encapsulated as a kid, and I had no apprehension of the politics and history of First Nations people, I still intimately felt the alienation of the official history and official social studies materials in public school, as many kids do. At the same time, I grew up around many First Nations, and I desperately wanted to know about them. For instance, across from the schoolyard at my elementary school, the Chiacton band had a sports field, and I always looked across at it and I wanted to know, just know. I saw native art everywhere and I wanted to know. I had a few friends from Chiacton at school, but I didn't have the knowledge to notice what was different about them in that context at school, public school, and so I didn't learn anything about them. As far as I knew, First Nations kids were pretty much just the same as any other kids, which is to say white. I think the colonial curriculum actually severed the ties that I should have been building within my community as a child to these communities. I don't think that you can deny that to grow up beside of people in your own town and not know them is some kind of violence to a person's psyche. These were the people that knew best the streams and forests I was struggling to make meaning of as a rural person. It was much harder to read the land and understand nature without Indigenous sensibilities. Typical Western materialist ideas, such as what I was learning in school, didn't offer enough depth to understand with my mind what I felt with my body in nature. As a child, I felt that, but I didn't know what to make of it. This was sort of an alienation that I didn't know how to interpret as a child. I succeeded at school because I was smart and I knew how to hide dissenting thoughts and other reasons. I watched a lot of people get sidelined slowly and systematically. They got kicked out, and I didn't. I was apparently what they wanted. Getting a job was an issue. All the things I was raised with at home were not marketable. I went through many jobs and careers, many universities as I grew up. From my parents, I learned about social justice, and from the Mennonites, I learned liberation theology and how to deconstruct oppressive social systems before university. By this time, I was a devout Christian. Being on the borders of so many cultures made me really interested in metaphysics and cosmology and all these different viewpoints and worldviews. Then I went to university, so skip forward a lot. I've had an 8-year journey now in counseling psychology, graduate school and whatnot, and a 16-year journey in and out of university overall. I've been to many institutions. I've had a hard time in school finding my place as a rural person of faith. I'm not sure if my accent is pronouncing that bad. Rural? Yeah? Okay. Rural. I get laughed at for my accent and word choices, and I fit in by learning to secularize my language before I talk in school. And again, I succeed, I fit in, and others don't, and I always see that from a position of privilege. I'm always someone who's not targeted. I don't tell stories about the forest I grew up in or the things that make up my life where I'm from, that are still the things that make up my life where I'm from, where I go home to. It's part of the way I succeed. My earlier experiences made me interested in examining social structures, as I said. Then multiculturalism in counseling psychology, when I ran into that in my counseling psychology training, was a big step forward for me in some ways, because it was a big move from some of the paradigms of helping that I've been taught most often in university, which were very monocultural and very Eurocentric. So multiculturalism was a big step forward in my understanding of helping theory there. One thing I learned in the past few years is that counseling is a form of education. Counseling psychology is actually in the faculty of education, historically has that root. It's education on the subject matter of life, if you can think about it that way. In the mainstream Canadian culture, adults don't look to elders or religion as much as they used to. Now you often listen to health professionals, whether it's on CBC or in a counseling office, when you're most in need. I've learned to see counseling as healing education. Multicultural counseling is about caring how different cultures think about healing. And this has helped me a lot in my work by legitimizing social justice leanings. So when I've wanted to work in different dignifying ways with different people, the language of multicultural counseling in my field has helped sort of legitimize some of the things I've been doing. In my adulthood, I realized I had been intentionally not educated about the history and politics of First Nations. Somehow they're missing from my knowledge of the world in a deep sense, like just a blank area. Intuitively, they're familiar to me because of how I lived beside them and learned about them as a cultural group growing up. Multicultural counseling gave me a way to frame this in my work with First Nations clients at first. However, things started to get more complicated when worldview left the confines of culture and entered the realm of religion, economics, history, cosmology, and metaphysics, all these aspects that I was learning about different First Nations perspectives. As I learned more about Indigenous ways of life, I found their knowledges made claims about our shared world that were not nicely stored in a box called culture over there. Histories of colonization, land grabs, residential schools were familiar to me at this point in my life, and these didn't fit in the box of culture either. So Indigenous people have said to me that knowledge comes from spiritual experiences of the land you live on, and suffering is a wounding of the soul. In my academic training, by and large, I've been taught to beneficently encapsulate these claims as cultural perspectives within a relativistic framework. This means that traumatic history becomes self-report data on perceptions of inequality rather than reports of inequality. It becomes self-report data on perceptions of inequality. It means that spiritual worlds become cultural phenomena. These then can be safely quantified, reported, and considered to be understood. This hasn't sat very well with me because of what I have done to hide my own spirituality and metaphysics in academia. Personally, I don't feel like my reality is being represented when it is reduced to a cultural perspective. I have begun to meet and learn in deep healing ways from First Nations peoples about the nature of the world that we share. I've learned about my own people's history as colonizers, but also as traditional, rural, and spiritual people. Between me and the Indigenous people I've learned from, I've found these compatibilities, not equivalencies, but compatibilities, and they've helped me put together my real history and to learn deeply and spiritually about what it is to be alive in the world and on the land. These dialogues have escaped most of the academic spaces designed to teach me about the standard Western model of the human mind and of life. Ironically, the voices that are most difficult to take as real and relevant in academia are the ones that are most validating to me, even though I'm a settler. A big change for me is to think of the history of healing education as a history in this place of the Fraser River, spanning from the mouth of the Fraser, where we are now, to many hundred K up past where I'm from. So in this area, like think of the history of healing education as something that's grounded in this area rather than a particular intellectual and disciplinary heritage. Usually I thought of the history of my field as a conglomeration of European and American developments over the last few hundred years at most. But today I think of the history of healing education as starting in this place 10,000 years ago, as recalled in First Nations oral history. what is seen as mainstream counseling psychology is a newcomer on this scene. The field has recent heritage in psychology, education, and medicine, and through this recent heritage, counseling psychology has been complicit in cultural repression and domestication recently, in terms of the 10,000-year spectrum. It has also been a force of healing for a lot of people as well, I believe, in my profession. So when I take into account the full history of healing education in this place, I feel more at home in it, and I understand myself and my life in better context. This is even so despite the pain of coming to awareness of my people's history of colonization. As a European Canadian settler, and as a spiritual and religious person, as a rural person, and as a traditional person, I'm more at home in healing education when I begin to understand its full history in this place. So, my way of reimagining my field as a field that both serves and influences society's ideas of what it means to be healthy, human, people, whatnot. In my imagination, I have thought of a system of counseling psychology training that would include this kind of history, include learning from all people's metaphysics and spiritualities and political histories, and would seek to understand political issues, including its own political issues. If counseling psychology education included students in this way, going beyond cultural sensitivity to different students coming into graduate school, I know I would feel more at home in it. And if that's true of me, who always fits in, I imagine it would be more relevant and more open to those whose histories of healing education in this place are much longer and also more at odds with mainstream US psychology, as it's called. So, a couple questions I have for the field, and maybe you guys consider them as well, but these are my questions to the field. What would it mean to form an academic atmosphere of healing education that gave First Nations realities the first voice at the table? A table that included everyone's knowledges and competing ontological claims, competing histories, competing ideas of what the world is, what people are. What would that mean to us as adult students of life, all of us as adult students of life, who will need at some point in the future to seek out healing education, as a lot of us at some point will end up talking to a counselor and be influenced by their ideas of what it is to be a human being and what it is to be in the world. What would it mean to those silent students who have had a more difficult time than I have had by far fitting into academic counseling psychology? And, I think my time is up, so thank you.